a big thank you to Housmans for organising this event this evening. Great to see you too, Marina. Don't think we've seen each other for, well, at least well over a year, so we'll fix something soon. Congratulations on your book. I enjoyed reading it. It was a rapid read because I only got it from Pluto a few days ago, but it really concentrated the mind. And of course, there were many things in the book that I recognised, things about Syriza. You mentioned the Greece Solidarity campaign, which we were both involved in, and so on. So it brought a lot back to me. So to start off with, I just wanted to ask you really, what was it like writing the book? Was it a difficult book to write? And to what extent is it your lived experience?
Thank you, Kate. It's great to see you after a year, as you said, and I'm so happy to have this discussion with you because I so much appreciate what have you done for the left during the crisis, for Greece and so on. So, but to your question, well, it is based on my lived experience, and it is also trying to bring together things that I have been working before the crisis on left populism. And it was a little bit difficult for me, and it was a little bit difficult emotionally. That was the most difficult thing about it, because I had been very much involved in what was happening in Greece, but also here. I needed some time, and this is why the book is coming out now, to take some emotional distance. You know, during the time that all these things were happening, I was feeling that I was disappointed by parties that I was part of. I was bitter in many cases, as other people have been as well. So I needed a little bit of time to take some distance and try to reflect a little bit on what happened, but also what happened mean in relation to left populism that I'm working, without being very, very emotionally involved. So my aim wasn't to tell off Syriza or Labour or somebody, but to reflect more and think how things could have been different, what we all together have achieved during this period, and how possibly we should think about the future if we were to engage with left populism seriously. Of course, left populism is not for everybody, but this is why I wanted to write the book, because I want to have this discussion. I want to have this discussion with you and with other people and think together. For me, we belong, even if we disagree in a lot of things, in the same commons.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, you said then, you know, left populism isn't for everybody. And when you start on the book, you say, some people say, why are you calling it populism? Isn't that a right-wing thing? You know, populism is seen in the framework of Trump and Bolsonaro and people like that. Why are you attaching this left tag to it? And then later on you say, and these same people, they say, yes, but what about class? And I thought, I've just fallen straight into Marina's worst case stereotype, because I thought, why is she calling it left populism? And what about class? In fact, I mean, you say that you wanted the book to be reflective, and it did actually. It was very reflective, and it made me think a lot more about this. So I did come round to some extent to your point of view. But perhaps for the audience, Marina, could you just lay out very simply what you mean by left populism and why you think it's useful to use that term?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I will start with populism, then what is left populism, and then we can bring class in. So populism has a very negative connotation these days. It's usually understood as very authoritarian leaders, that they lie to gullible people and lie, and they made them follow them. So I wanted to, first of all, explain left populism as a different political logic, going beyond this negative connotation that it has for newspapers. And there is a lot of articles The Guardian and other newspapers about populism, but they approach it from a different theoretical perspective. Now, in my perspective, populism is not about content. So it's not about policies, it's not about the vision of the future. It is, and this is important, it is a political logic. It is a big way of doing politics. The other one would be institutional logic. So I'm talking mainly about these two big logics. So populism, for me, it's form rather than content. And that means that it can take content either that it will take it to the left or content that it will take it to the right. And we've seen the right-wing populists. I think Boris Johnson is one of them as well. And we can talk about a different vision, different politics, different content, which I call left populism. But I have to say here, all the parties that I'm talking about, Syriza or Labour or Podemos, apart maybe from Podemos, they were not engaged consciously in left populism. This wasn't the theories that they are reading. In Greece, for example, Syriza would be, or big organizations of Syriza would be reading Poulantzas, for example. So it's not that they engage with left populism, neither that they were totally left populist parties. They had elements of that. And possibly the only party that it was engaging more consciously with this theoretical strand, maybe it was Podemos, but a particular part of Podemos, the Podemos that it had to do with Errejón's work. So populism, as I said, a big political logic that has certain characteristics, mainly two, brings different diverse demands together to create a people. I can talk more about how this process happens. And then these people are against an establishment. So effectively, it is a process of doing politics that polarizes society, divides society, creates frontiers between the two. Now, I was interested in the left populism, which it is much easier, and there is a big tradition of talking about the right-wing populists. But I believe there is something to be said about what will be the characteristics or the content of the left in left populism. People will say, yeah, but we know that stuff. But what we have usually in mind is Latin America, and the situation in Europe is quite different from Latin America. So I wanted to talk about the left populism, or the elements that existed in these parties that I would call left populist, but within the European context. Now, having said that, other people who do populism may not like exactly what I say, because they talk a lot about populism as an electoral strategy. So you have to do that and then we win elections. Unfortunately, I'm not that big on elections. I don't mean that we shouldn't win elections, and populism has this element that you have to have a challenge to the establishment, electoral, but it could be other types of challenge. And for me, populism starts much earlier than that. It starts from the grassroots, it starts from movements, and some people call this type of populism grassroots populism. So there will be people who do populism that they wouldn't necessarily agree with me, but I don't want to see it as something that is relevant only for elections. I think our desires, our visions go beyond elections, and they start before the elections as well. Sorry, I don't know if I managed to give a summary of how.
No, that's very, very good summary. And because I'm not used to reading political theory, because now I've left academia, I seem to spend a lot of time out with the banners and things like that, and talking about nuclear weapons. But I suppose what I really took from it was that a lot of it is about creating a sense of a people, a kind of united people, which is can be quite diverse, but their issues can be brought together. So it's a kind of diverse, yet inclusive, people coming together and realizing that they are a people because they have shared goals and aims and values, but they're also posed against something. So the example that is the kind of the 99% and the 1%. So it's the people versus the elite, or in the case of Spain, la casta, the caste, the kind of ruling corrupt elite and so on. So that's, and then them mobilizing and that sort of thing. So in essence, is that, have I got it right?
Yes, definitely. But you see, it is this 99%, which doesn't speak the same language as class necessarily. That doesn't mean that class is not there, but it is something different. It is this diversity of demands that they come together, that they cut across classes in the first instance. And they create, as you very well explained, these people. So there is a problem there.
Can I just throw something in on that class question? Because it reminded me of a bit of the debates around class and so on in the 1980s, when I was still in the Communist Party, and there was a whole thing about Euro-communism, social movements and all that kind of thing. And the debate was between sort of the definition of class as people who produce, whatever it is, surplus value or something. So people who are producing goods, for example. So it's about people's relationship to the means of production, rather than whether or not they have to work for a living. You see what I mean? So a kind of narrow conception of the working class versus a very broad conception of the working class, which encompasses everyone has to work for a living. And that's basically pretty much the 99% or 95% maybe, but it's the kind of majority. So do you think the kind of class thing is perhaps overstated because it's not taking into account the changed nature of class?
I think you are absolutely right. First of all, you are absolutely right in how you place this debate, because a lot of this debate comes from the 1980s. That's when this debate started to become more prominent, or the theories that I'm talking about. And they wanted to challenge exactly this strict definition of class, but also there is something else, the necessity of, or the unity of class as the only possible struggle that you will have. And it started empirically in a way. So the empirical thing is that you had from the 60s onwards a lot of things that they are happening, and CND behind you, maybe also part of that as an example, where we had big movements that they were not only labor movements. They didn't only have economic demands, they could have other demands as well. And it wanted to open our understanding or space to understand this type of struggles as well. So that was the context. Now, in the 60s also, we had instances, for example, in communist parties, that in front of movements that they were not strictly defined as labor movements, as I said, a lot of these parties, they were unable to grasp them, to connect with these movements in a certain way. So this is where these debates are coming from. And the main thing in relation to class, it should be not that class is absent or that class doesn't play a role, but that how a struggle will be defined is something that is happening in the process of the struggle. And it is not absolutely necessary that it can only be a class struggle. That's what it changes. It's a big change, theoretically, because we are not talking about the traditional Marxist theories anymore. We are talking about post-Marxism, people that they question a bit the economism of Marxism, the necessity, as I said, of defining struggles as only class struggles, how predetermined the struggles are as the unity of the working class, or if in the process of doing that, we can talk about democratic struggles or other struggles. But I have to say, we were reading Marxism. It is something, it is a critique of Marxism, but it is still Marxist. Not in the traditional sense, but I think we have to bring out, I want to bring this out, that it's not that class is absent. It's just that how we will define the struggle, it is not necessarily across class lines.
Okay, so I'm going to take you on now to a slightly different aspect of the book, which is the question of where left populism emerges from geographically and the kinds of struggles. And you take it back to the financial crash of 2008, and then the austerity policies and the kind of very harsh reality of those in places like Greece and Spain, and of course also Portugal. We know it has had a big impact in many countries. So it seemed, and I always thought this at the time, when watching the Indignados and the Squares movement, there was sort of nothing, I thought you were a bit harsh on the British anti-austerity movement, but I mean, in comparison to what happened in Southern Europe, it was, relatively tame. So why was there such an upsurge in Southern Europe? Why were the protests so militant? I mean, thinking back to the TV coverage of Spain, where the people were preventing the evictions taking place from houses, and there were thousands on the streets and so on. Why was the movement so dynamic and vibrant in Southern Europe? Are people more militant and more conscious of themselves as a people? And is there any way in which that is linked to having had the experience of dictatorship and having come out of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is an interesting question, because as you said, I'm more hard in relation to my criticism of what was happening in Britain. But the reason is because I want to draw this difference between what was happening in Britain and what was happening in Greece, for example, or Spain. And I don't think people in Greece and Spain are more militant necessarily. They have a different experience, as you said, the dictatorship and so on. With that go other problems, however, as well. But what happened after the crisis for me is that these countries were hit so hard that there was such a big shock to all of us that the political affiliations that we had before, they collapsed. People who were relatively well off, and they thought that we are okay, we will be safe in this life. Suddenly, they found that they are not safe at all. And this in the book, I don't know if I use the term is dislocation, to show that you have this crisis that totally changes and cuts the affiliations or the political affiliations that you had. So this is what happened in Greece, and that's when the people started to be created. In Britain, it wasn't the same. The shock wasn't the same. And I know that because I was here. I mean, that doesn't mean that a lot of people didn't suffer. That doesn't mean that we didn't have hundreds of thousands of people dying. But it means that it didn't hit so hard such a big part of the population as you had in Greece or Spain. Now, the thing is that, of course, we had a movement and people were demonstrating, we were there as well. But for me, a movement needs more stuff. It's not enough to demonstrate, or to put it in a language that we have all discussed at some point. Is it enough to say that we have a movement when we just move from A to B and then we do that again and again? And I think it needs something more, which it happened in Greece and Spain. The evictions, it was a whole movement connected with the squares, but it wasn't only that people were in the squares. You take it and you bring it into the everyday life in a way that a long time ago, the unions were doing in Britain. It wasn't only about membership or going in a strike. This was part of your everyday life, of what you were doing. And this is what happened, I think, in Greece and Spain, which was quite different from Britain. And this brought people together.
Okay, so that brings us neatly on to the fact that you chose pretty much 3 case studies, and we've got a little bit more time left, so I'm just going to want to touch briefly on each of those, a bit about the similarities and differences. So first of all, Podemos, okay, this was in Spain, as people will know. Just a couple of things about that. I suppose the main thing is that, which I remember well from the time, Podemos wanted to go beyond left and right. Okay, so that actually reminds me, again, going back to the 80s, there was a journal at the time called Marxism Today, which was the journal of the Communist Party, and the editor, Martin Jakes, kind of took it off on a kind of a different trajectory, and he was going on about the end of left and right kind of thing. So it's an idea that's been around for a while. I'm not sure I understand absolutely what it means. So could you very briefly, Marina, just tell us what does that mean to go beyond left and right?
I think this was part of what Podemos were discussing, as you said. And the idea there is that you had an established left, which was part of the establishment as well. And the same can be said in Greece with the Communist Party of Greece. So what they meant with that is that because they wanted to connect diverse demands and diverse groups of people, but also people were wary of any establishment part, including the left parties, which we saw that both in Greece and Spain, the traditional communist parties, they didn't gain in terms of votes or anything like that. They were not that big in the debates that they were happening at that point. So because I think for Podemos, because Podemos was a new party, it could do that, it could talk like that. Because they wanted to show that they wanted to create these people with these demands, bringing them together, they didn't want to take the traditional mapping of the political sphere. And they could do it because they were bringing the energy of the movements, and the movements were not right or left, they were the people. That doesn't mean that they were right-wing. Of course, there is something left there. Now, in Syriza, it was a different case because it has a different tradition. It wasn't as young as Podemos. But again, because of the situation, and although it was a left party, but a party that it hadn't been seen as establishment, they could bring together again very diverse people which norm and demands that normally they wouldn't go for a left party. So in this sense, they try to go beyond left and right. That doesn't mean that the left is dead. Is how we approach a situation where you have to be at the establishment, and in many cases, even the left or part of the left or some left has been part of the same establishment. So you try to connect these diverse demands, go beyond left and right. But of course, as I said, some of these parties, they are left, and that's why I want to keep the left in front of left populism.
Yes, because in fact, it seems to me Podemos to me is a left party, whatever new forms it has, whatever it does with digital and all that kind of thing, it's basically of the left as far as I can see. And of course, it came into participating in government because it joined with Izquierda Unida and formed Unidas Podemos. I know that was controversial within the party itself, but nevertheless, that happened. But there was just the one thing which struck me, because it was all about doing politics differently, which of course was term which my own party, Left Unity, used as well at the time. And that was, that was about what it was all about, doing politics differently. And then the question of having leaders or not having leaders, and, should you have a charismatic leader, or is it about the people and the grassroots and all that sort of thing? And then looking at, the same applies to Syriza actually, but looking at Podemos in particular, 3 main leaders, all men. Syriza, main leader, a man, and then of course Labour, Jeremy Corbyn. So where are the women in this? And I know they're there, but also of course in Spain, and people like Ada Colau, the mayor, she's mayor of Madrid or Barcelona. So there are women there maybe in the leadership in the municipalities, but it seems quite an old time male thing, doesn't it, to have all these men leaders?
Yes, and also I think that this is something that I haven't developed enough in the book, and it needs more development. This aspect, gender, feminism, and so on. But I want to start a little bit before, because you said about Podemos. You see, the issue with Podemos and the left is that for a lot of people, when it connected with Izquierda Unida, which is a more traditional left, a lot of people thought that this would be detrimental to them. It could have been, although I find it very interesting, because we have to remember that Syriza also asked the Communist Party to join them, and they said no. That would have been their first choice. So with Podemos, connecting with Izquierda Unida, and then with PSOE as well, being in a coalition, you see, it loses its radical edge. It loses this anti-establishment thing. And a lot of people were telling me these days about the Madrid local elections. And the thing is that Podemos, although they didn't lose, actually they won a little bit, but they didn't win enough. The other party that it was more related with left populism, it was Mas Madrid, and it did very well. It almost got as many votes as PSOE. But I haven't followed the campaign they did. Some people have told me that it was as Podemos was at the start and much more towards this populism, but I haven't followed. Now, left unity, for me, it is a very interesting question. But I'll tell you how, because it starts bringing different groups of the left together in a similar way that Syriza did. But as I said, the dislocation, the shock to the system, which will reject all the established parties, it wasn't there because you have the Labour Party. And this is also a criticism there. Well, it's not a criticism, it's a comment about the British situation, why I say that there wasn't such a big shock. Because, well, in the system that we have, you have 2 parties, either Conservatives or Labour. Okay, either you will come first or second. If the shock was much harder, that's where you will see a big difference, rejecting the parties which they have been established.
As you also mentioned in the book, we have the first past the post thing. But just quickly on left unity before I move on to the next much more important subject, which is going to be Syriza. With left unity, of course, we were formed we were founded as a party in 2013, and the initiative for it came in November of 2012, at the time of the European general strike, which our TUC supported for the first time. So we were very much born out of that. And of course, in pre-Corbyn days, when precisely Labour and Conservative were like the kind of extreme centre or whatever it is that Tariq Ali calls it, both neoliberal parties. So, we were born out of this same thing. But of course, because of the British specific characteristics, Labour, first past the post, we were unable to take off in the same way. But moving on to Syriza then, now this is a very interesting subject, obviously very close to your heart. Sometimes here it was caricatured as from heroes to traitors, in a matter of months, which was a ridiculously simplistic perspective, in my opinion. And as you touched on, it was, there are many similarities with Podemos politics, obviously, but differences as well. Podemos was entirely new. Syriza had its origins in uniting the left groups and so on. But there are just a couple of things. I was very touched by what you wrote about solidarity for all. The audience may be aware of this or not. This was a kind of Greece-wide solidarity movement, which had links externally as well, international solidarity and so on. Not only did it help set up social clinics and pharmacies and so on, but it also looked at new ways of organising economic production. And I remember when I was on a Greece Solidarity campaign delegation to Athens, meeting one of the local mayors, they were doing stuff like that. There was the potato movement going on, which was, produce being brought directly from the fields to the consumers. I mean, there was a real social ferment going on, born of necessity, obviously, but really kind of quite radical ideas and practice as well. I mean, how central was that to what Syriza was doing, and how much has that continued?
First of all, I have to say here that this movement, the solidarity for all and so on, at some point there was an umbrella organization, Solidarity for All, but the people who were doing that in every neighborhood and so on, some of them, they were in Syriza, but it's not that it was organized by Syriza. I think what Syriza did is it took the energy of all this activity on the grassroots and it took it to the electoral level, and then it abandoned it, which is a big problem for me. But so you see, this for me answers other things. When we say, for example, that we lose because of the media and so on, I do believe that what you need is the people on the ground. This is every neighborhood in Greece. It had this movement. It had solidarity networks. People were everywhere trying to help, trying to talk politics. This is our power, the power of the people. Then Syriza takes this power or these demands, let's say, within a very difficult context to the electoral level. But one problem there for me is that it then abandons the party, the government abandons the party, and the party abandons its grassroots. So then you have something that is very top-down, and it is very difficult to win if you don't have the media, you don't have all sorts of things, and you don't have the people. Well, okay, it's not going to fly exactly.
Yeah. So it's very interesting, and one of the things that I also remember from the time, because this also fed into left unity, which is about policy commissions, and kind of grassroots ideas coming from the people into the policies, into the party and so on. And in fact, another friend of mine, Helena Sheehan, I don't know if you know her, she wrote this fabulous book, The Syriza Wave, Surging and Crashing with the Greek Left. And she was over there a lot. And she talked about the energy in those commissions and the quite extraordinary nature of them. And it's almost she was more positive and enthusiastic about them than you.
I was a member.
Do you think she's yes, exactly. Maybe it gives you an extra insight, but surely there were remarkable developments that took place. But then this process of taking it into government, that's presumably where things started, in your view, to go wrong, or things became disconnected. The base, from the leadership and the party and all that became disconnected. But given the nature of political structures in society and the structures of politics and society, is it possible to have a party or something in government which retains that organic relationship with the people, with the party, with the grassroots? Can that happen?
I hope it can happen. Although maybe if you push me a lot, I will go in a more anarchist direction. But the thing for me is that when you come to government, and especially in the conditions that Syriza came, because there were objective problems as well. So you have a memorandum, you cannot move very much on the economic level and make the changes and do the policy that you wanted to do. So what are you going to do if you are a left party? So what I think, two things that you have to do is keep the grassroots and the party, because this is your power, and open up structures that allow more participation. So this is one. If there is something radical, it should be that you open up a different structure that allows much more participation and decision taken, not only top down, but bottom up. The second thing you can do is to assist the economic experiments that we have, not because everything is going to change overnight, but this is what is going to radicalize how we understand the economic activity and so on. And I think that is where the problem is, that Syriza and other parties, they have done the same. The moment they come to power, it is as if they want to persuade everybody, well, not everybody, the electorate, that they can be establishment. And then, okay, then you become something else.
Okay, this takes us neatly on to your third case study, which of course is the Corbyn and Labour situation, and that is a kind of an absolutely clear example of, you know, trying to democratize something, trying to bring the grassroots in, and the leader trying to do that, but the kind of the machine and structures of the party preventing that, and also the machine and structures of the establishment eventually preventing that. But the question I wanted to start off with here is about Labour being a social democratic party, because Syriza, Podemos, new formulation of previous parties, but consciously sort of radical left, built out of the new movements and the new context, and posing themselves against social democracy. So PASOK had been pretty much destroyed, self-destruct by embracing neoliberalism. PSOE, not so damaged by it that it couldn't come back, but nevertheless still in that kind of being knocked back framework. But Labour, I mean, what an extraordinary thing that wave of sort of the radical left wave, if I can call it that, or left populist wave, but those ideas, the kind of left ideas, came to find an outlet in Labour. Did you ever think that it would be possible to change what was essentially a neoliberal social democratic party into a vehicle for radical left ideas, left populism, you know, transformation of society? Because I think you joined the Labour Party, didn't you? So did you think that change was possible?
I think parties, they are not only one thing, and they have different periods, let's say. So to give you an example, PASOK, which is the one that totally collapsed in Greece and opened up the way for Syriza. In the early days, something like 1981 to 83, for example, it was quite a radical populist party. It was a radical populist party because it came in a particular period where after the dictatorship, some very basic democracy where big parts of the left were still excluded. Excluded means you couldn't find a job. All these people, they had been in exiles. And for the PASOK, for Greece, it was that it brought this excluded left back within the political process. So it had a radical movement, and then it becomes much less radical and then very social democratic. And I think Labour Party had an opposite process, this process that we saw with Jeremy Corbyn. Unfortunately, I think the best elements were having to pick a fight within the party itself. And this for me, it's not a movement. It keeps you within the confines of this party. Now, there were other things that there were happening, and I don't think what happened with the Labour Party, it only has to do with Corbyn and so on. It has to do with how the opposite side responds as well. And I think while Corbyn was doing quite well, the first part, when they had the establishment right wing, it started to do less so when we have the populist right wing, which for me it's Boris Johnson, because they are nationalist in a particular way. They are anti-establishment, although they are totally the establishment. This is the funny thing about them. They are the total establishment, which suddenly appears as anti-establishment, as speaking the true talk, what other people didn't manage to. And this is quite difficult to deal with, not only for the Labour Party, but I think a lot of the left as well. Also, I think because the idea that I'm thinking these days is because the left really believes in politics. They want the process to work. We want politics. We want a better society. I don't think the right gives a toss about that. They would say whatever. Mm-hmm. So it is difficult to deal in that situation. So the Labour Party, I think it was transformed. And what if we can keep something from the experience with Jeremy Corbyn is that there is space for a different Labour Party, but also there is a big left in Britain as well. Now the question is how we will organize, what we do next, how much space there is to do that in the Labour Party, and I don't know the answer to that. Okay.
I've got one more quick question for you, and then we're going to go to the audience. Mm-hmm. My quick final question is, was "for the many, not the few" a left populist slogan?
It is a slogan that a lot of theorists will take as the epitome of populism, but I don't think you can decide what is populist just because they have a slogan. I mean, I can go out and give a talk and say, I am for the people. Yeah. Well, that doesn't necessarily solidifies the situation. There was this element there, but I think the populism that we can associate with the Labour Party is creating the people within the party itself. So this mass of people that they came around Corbyn and they tried to do something within the party, a lot of them they were not part of the Labour Party, or they don't necessarily affiliate themselves as leftists with the Labour Party. So I don't think a slogan or just talking about the people is enough to say that, oh, this is left populism.
It's a great slogan, though.
It is.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to go to some questions, and can I encourage the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We have got a little bit of time left. Firstly, I'm turning to Omer Tekdemir. Omer, thank you for your question. And this actually relates to the final section in Marina's book. Is there any possibility to have an international populist movement in left-wing discourse? And that is something you address, Marina, isn't it, in your final chapter? Could you comment on that?
Yes, I hope there is. You can create a people that goes beyond borders and beyond nations. And I think a form of that, although the nation state is still very important, we have seen in Latin America, you need an enemy that you stand against, but we can see how different countries, they came together, they created institutions as well, that their aim was to create a different economic organization for the continent as well. But this is the Latin American example. In Europe, we start seeing something like that with DiEM25. The problem, this transnational populism, a people that they will challenge the EU and the institutions of the EU. Of course, I have a problem there. I think I made it explicit. I think a lot of the stuff with DM, they were top down and they were not connected with grassroots. But I hope that there is this possibility. And possibly the EU, it is a place where these people can come together. I don't mean that this is happening right now, but I want to think that there is a transnational populist potential. Let's put it like that there.
Yeah.
I was amazed always how many people in Britain, they loved Varoufakis. I'm not huge in loving Greek men, but okay, what was it there that people liked in Britain about him? And it was this anti-establishment thing. They wanted somebody who will go in higher institutions in the EU and tell them, well, I shouldn't swear, I think we are recording.
To get lost, I think, is the polite version of what you were going to say.
To get lost, yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, and that's very interesting. And DiEM25 has had some success, hasn't it, in some countries? But that idea of, or the attempt to have a kind of parallel set of structures across different European countries that don't seem to have too much linking to what's going on in the grassroots in those countries and the actual movements. That's problematic, I think. But
yeah,
the aim of having a transnational thing, I think, is fantastic. It just, more development. Okay, thank you very much, Omar, for that. And next question is from Bob Williams Finley. Hi, Bob. Bob says, doesn't left populism share methodology with social movements?
Yes, it shares something. First of all, I have to say that this is more what I'm trying to put forward in terms, that's why I said at the beginning that I'm talking about grassroots populism. Other people may want to emphasize more the leaders, which they are men, as Kate said, and what is happening top down. So they have a vision of populism, of verticality, that it is top down. And this is not something that it doesn't exist. But by talking about movements and the grassroots, which I want to do, is to expand also the horizontal aspect of populism, to make it more democratic, to make it less top down, to make it less about the leaders, which, as I said, I'm not very keen on a lot of them. So the moment for me where these demands start to come together, and I think this is what Bob means, is in the moment of the movements. That's when you have the first instance that you see a people being created, different demands coming together, diverse groups in the squares. The question is, what do you do after that? And I think the next step is important also for populism, that you have to transfer this into a different side, the electoral side. Now, I said at the beginning of the book, it could be even a much more confrontational thing or a more revolutionary, but I don't think it will happen in the context that we are discussing. So I agree with Bob that something starts, that populist movement starts already in the grassroots. Now, what it doesn't happen, and this is where methodologically we have a difference, is that you need progressively, apart from bringing the demands together, you need an umbrella that it's going to, with which, or a term, or a leader, or a party, or an idea that people will start to identify with. This happened in the first instance with the name Indignados. That's how we understand all these different groups, our identity. But also, I think it has to, in order to be a more significant challenge, it has to move beyond the movements as well, not to stop with the movements. And I don't mean that in a way that I want to play down the role of movements in bringing change.
Mm. Okay, so Omar is just following up. If it is okay to ask how the transnational populism, particularly the non-representative grassroots or square movements, can have a leadership Marina will be in favour of an organic leadership of working class by providing a counter-hegemonic culture. And if I could just I'll add something of my own to that, because it a bit ties in with what I was going to put as my final question. So maybe we can kind of take these in together, and then I think perhaps we'll conclude at that point. So there are two strong things that come through in the book. One is the whole question of horizontalism, and you touch on that particularly when you're talking about things like Occupy and some of the squares movements and so on. And I'm not quite sure personally how you feel about horizontalism, but you do point out, of course, that this potentially is at odds with governing, and that the whole kind of dynamic around grassroots versus being in government, that's a kind of bit of an issue. And then the other thing which comes through strongly is democratization of the parties. And you talk a lot about this, and it's very central to your narrative. So one of my formative experience of horizontalism was during the European Social Forum process, okay? And of course, Syriza was, or not Syriza, Synespismos was big in the European Social Forum, and there was one of them happened in Athens and so on. So the Greek left was kind of very involved in it. And there were people who said that horizontalism was, the essence of democracy and really important and all that sort of thing. And I was at a meeting once about preparing for the European Social Forum in London, and there was maybe, I don't know whether there were some dozens, maybe 100 people in a room, and we had this long discussion and we'd come to a consensus, except for one person, okay? And because of the kind of horizontal approach being implemented at that time, everyone had to agree, or the kind of issue fell, okay? So I thought, how can that be democratic, that what the overwhelming majority wants falls by the wayside because one person is standing out against it? Isn't there a problem with that concept of democracy? So maybe you could comment on those things, and then also comment on what Omar was saying about leadership and so on in the movements.
First of all, let me start with European Social Forum in Athens. For us, it was very important. For us as Syriza, it was very important. So what enabled something like Syriza to happen, it was because different groups of the left, they were already coming together in places like the European Social Forum, and in that way, getting more acquainted and getting together with each other. So because I have in the book a lot of interviews from different people in Syriza or other parties, one of the things that they say is the importance of the European Social Forum in the future, enabling these processes of creating left parties where you bring together different groups. So very, very, very important. Now, the question is with movements and populism is okay, and that's why I spent quite a lot of time. We said about movements, and then we say about parties that they will take that to electoral level. How much the parties influence the organization of movements? And at that point, a lot of us, we were thinking and writing about movement parties. So parties that they will have different, much more democratic structures, allowing more participation and be less top-down. Now, for me, the idea of absolute horizontality doesn't exist. Pure horizontality, it cannot happen. It cannot happen because there is a mutual condemnation for me between horizontality. You will always have some aspect of verticality in there. I have written a more theoretical paper, which is academic, which I'm discussing that horizontality and verticality in the squares. So this horizontality, and especially in the context that you put it, Kate, we have to take some decisions. We have to move ahead. And there is this person, yeah? You cannot have this. You cannot stop acting just for one person. It will be fantastic if everybody is together. So you cannot have this pure horizontality. You can have processes where people talk together and come together, and this is different. But pure horizontality for me, it cannot exist. It is always, and it should be possibly contaminated by some verticality, because we have to move on and life is short. Now, in terms of transnational populism, I mean, it is pragmatically like that. You cannot just sit and wait. Transnational populism, I'm not sure what was the question. Sorry, I missed the question.
Okay, so he said, how transnational populism, particularly the non-representative grassroots or square movements, can have a leadership. Marina will be in favour of an organic leadership of working class by providing a counter-hegemonic culture. I don't know if that's a correct assumption or not, but if you've got any comments.
I can talk a little bit about, first of all, I'm not huge on the idea of leaders, as I said before. So in transnational populism, and I don't think also that we have to have one leader. There are other ways to organize things, and again, bringing and having a transnational populist project. So for me, transnational populism, as what I was talking about populism, it has to start from the grassroots. It's not just me and Kate get together and say, let's create this transnational project. For this to happen, we have to bring in what they exist, cross borders together. Of course, having said that, the nation state still persists, even if some talk about the death of the nation state and so on. And we have to take this in account. There are different interests, there are nation states, there is nationalism and so on. But we have seen in a lot of solidarity movements, even if sometimes they have to be much more active in my perception, that things can go beyond borders. And this will be what transnational populism is. It is important because the institutions that we need to challenge these days, like the EU, they are transnational. So we have to come together and challenge them.
Okay. And thanks, Ömer, for that. Ömer explains that he's also working and writing about left-wing populism of the Kurds by the HDP in Turkey. So that's very interesting.
And a lot of people are interested in that in Greece as well, everywhere.
Okay, so our time is up, I think. Thanks to the audience for questions. In other words, thanks, Bob and Ömer. That's very useful and interesting questions. Big thank you to Marina.
And thank you, Kate. It was lovely to see you again after a year.
Yes. And I highly recommend your book to everybody, Marina. I think it's a great read. It really opened my mind, which is always a good thing. So thanks
very, very much. It means a lot, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.